Thank you for joining us for this month's Let My People Go webinar. Our goal is to really wrestle with how the local church can address vulnerability, because we believe that human trafficking is the exploitation of vulnerability for commercial gain. And if we strategically care for the very people that traffickers target, we will find ourselves doing the work of prevention, intervention, and aftercare all in one fell swoop, because we're ultimately caring for those who could be, are, or have been trafficked. As always, we will talk for about 15 to 20 minutes today, and then there will be a time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please put them in the question and answer box, ask us, and we will talk about them after my guest and I have our conversation. And I am joined today by Pastor Doyle DeGraw. Pastor Doyle works with Crossroads Church in Long Island, and he's going to tell you more about himself. And so, without further ado, thank you so much for joining me today, Doyle. Could you tell us a little bit about who you are and where you serve, that kind of thing?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you today. Yeah, I've been in pastoral ministry for 40 plus years, and about 6 years ago, my wife Kathy and I were asked to come to Long Island, and so we're originally from California, but we were living in Michigan at the time, and we moved from Michigan, Grand Rapids, Michigan, to Stony Brook, New York, which is on the North Shore, and we were involved in taking a church, doing what's called a fresh start. We took a church that was struggling and kind of helped them go through the grieving process of letting that church go, and then planted a new church that we call Crossroads. And so about 4.5 years ago, we launched that church and began the process of, we had a lot of young couples begin to join us. And so our ministry is to Stony Brook, specifically the Suffolk County, Long Island. Long Island has 2.9 million people. So we have a lot of people that are well off and wealthy, and we also have the other end of the spectrum, and actually the truth is, even the ones that have a lot of wealth and resource are in many ways as vulnerable as some that don't have very much. And so so that's what we've done. And the decision we made early on was our paradigm as a church is we build through small groups that we call missional communities. And one of the purposes and focuses of each group is to find a missional focus and emphasis. And so that's how we kind of got connected with you, Raleigh, and Let My People Go. Kathy and I had gone to the launch of Let My People Go. I guess, gosh, that's been 2 years ago now.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we realized, wow, this is the kind of thing that our team, the one small group that we connect with, had been talking a lot about, but we didn't know. I mean, we kept checking different resources and avenues, and we just didn't really find the right fit. And we thought this might be what we're looking for. So that's what began our relationship to you and the organization, and we began that process. So.
Well, it's interesting because some people will talk about their launch events, especially if they launch they launch in a big way, which I felt like we did. Sometimes you don't remember everyone who showed up. It's almost like a wedding. Like, people show up, you're glad they came, but you're so focused on what's about to happen that some other details may just be, in one ear out the other. You just don't remember. But I remember meeting you, and I remember us talking about what this could look like in Long Island. And it's interesting because a lot of those who may be watching may not actually know that you were one of our first church partners. And for us, Let My People Go, we're not just a training organization or an organization that goes and speaks on human trafficking. Our goal is to equip and empower the local church to fight human trafficking by loving those most vulnerable. So we want to help churches identify those most vulnerable and then respond. We want to see them recognize and respond to people that traffickers would normally exploit. And so one way that we do this is through developing justice ministry teams. And this kind of team, as Doyle will tell you, their goal is to not only do a community needs assessment, but their goal is also to be first responders in the church, caring for those who are vulnerable, like walking with them, doing life with them, and really helping make the church a safe place for all vulnerable people who attend. And that would be the people who may know they're vulnerable and the people who don't. But helping the church really love hurting people well. And so my first question really regards picking the right people or people who are the best fit for a justice ministry team. And Doyle, how did you know who would be the best fit for your justice ministry team?
I think it happened a couple of ways. One was common language. The team of people we were with, we were talking about the same things. When we were gathered together, we'd find ourselves find out that somebody else in the group had been looking at, a different organization, national, international organizations, like International Justice Mission or something like that, and saying, and kind of began dreaming like, what? In fact, I remember one of our team, he's been dreaming for a long time of what would it look like to actually work for that kind of organization and those kinds of things. And so it was common language. And then interestingly enough, the group that we began to hang out with on a regular basis, our small group, our missional community, we realized we all have certain areas where we're in touch with the vulnerable population. It's everywhere. One of our team members is a pediatrician, another is a social worker, and we have a nurse. Because besides being a pastor, I'm a mental health counselor. So we had different pieces that, wow, this all looks like it's a good fit. And even the ones that work in other areas that you wouldn't think of, like one of our team members owns a landscaping and a tree company. And interestingly enough, a lot of his workers are vulnerable because they came to America from other countries, and they're here on work visas, and their communities are the ones that Let My People Go is helping us to focus on in terms of just being aware. So that's how it kind of all came together, and it just continued. The momentum started, and then we realized this is the thing we should do.
So for those of you who are just now joining us on Facebook Live, I am talking to Pastor Doyle DeGraw, and he is the pastor of Crossroads Church in Long Island. And they have been partnered with Let My People Go since really the beginning. And what we are talking about today is how we can develop teams in our churches that can help our churches care for those who are most vulnerable to exploitation. And so Doyle has just shared a little bit with how we can find the right people who can do the work. Doyle, one thing that I've noticed is when I talk to different people in different churches, a lot of them want to do something. They want to fight human trafficking. They want to dive in. But what I found is when I would just start developing teams with whoever wanted to be involved, once the shine wore off, a lot of these people would be gone. And that really posed a problem for me because I'm trying to develop a team that will really help these people who are used to being let down. And if our team completely dissipates, then we've left things worse off than we found them.
Mhm.
And so how do you face that challenge of making sure, yes, the right people are on the team, but that the right people stay on the team?
Well, you know, early on, we had a lot of momentum. And then, actually, frankly, we kind of got stuck and we were a little bit overwhelmed with all that we felt like we needed to be figuring out. Um, we had, I'd say we had a pretty big learning curve. And so,
Right.
um, as we process that learning curve, um, I guess the way we could tell who should be on the team is that there was a lot of perseverance through that, because it was like, um, okay, this is a little frustrating. Actually, frankly, it got a little discouraging for a little while. But I guess we could tell that the team, there was still this feeling like, well, we don't want to give up. We're just not sure what to do. And I know at one point along the way, that's why, we came back to you and said, wow, we're kind of, we kind of messed things up. We're not sure we're approaching this right. Remember, we had a FaceTime conversation with you, our whole team together. And, so I guess the way we knew is, even though they could have just said, well, let's just forget the whole thing. I mean, what do we get into this for? They still wanted to press through. They weren't sure how, but they didn't want to give up. So I think that's a big deal, because this is not easy.
No, not easy at all. And that's what I love about how you guys have responded to it, because I tell churches all the time, I'm like, if you're going to care for those most vulnerable, you have to understand it's messy. As you work with other vulnerable people, it's going to expose your issues and your brokenness.
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, that's kind of a godsend, because as we love hurting people and realize that we're hurting people as well, like that we're broken, that we struggle, that we have our own things that we're trying to process. If we do that, then we're actually in a good place to care for other people without accidentally exploiting them.
Mm-hmm.
And I've noticed that a lot of us really do want to help until we realize what that's going to cost us. And I tell every church we partner with, it's tough. There are going to be times where you want to quit, but that's why you have a network like Let My People Go Network, who you can call and say, hey, I'm almost done. Give me a reason to keep going.
Mm-hmm.
Help me think through how to get over this hurdle. Because any of us can read a book on developing a justice ministry. That's simple. But it's really easy to forget everything that you read in that book when something happens. I refer to something that Mike Tyson said a long time ago: everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. I think that's it. I think I've said that several times in our webinars, because it just rings so true. It's easy to have an idea of what to do before you start doing it. And then when you start doing it and it becomes like difficult and you start dealing with issues in real time, you need people to walk alongside of you. And that's what I've loved about our relationship, is we've been able on coaching calls to kind of walk alongside of each other. And there have been things where you guys have been like, how do we do this? And we've been able to walk through it. And to see you guys climbing over that hurdle, for me, is joy giving, because every church, no matter where they are, they're going to hit hurdles. And your justice ministry team, the only way I think that people are going to stick to it is when they know that this isn't bigger than us. We're not doing this alone. And for all the questions we may have, there are answers. We may not know those answers, and it may take a little while to get those answers, but we're going to get there. And so I've loved to see, I've really enjoyed seeing how your church has kind of taken the bull by the horn, so to speak, and just plodded along. I mean, that might be mixing metaphors, but it's been incredible to see like how you guys have just worked through like just opposition, and that's been pretty incredible. And so speaking of opposition, what are some of the other challenges that you face?
Well, I think one of the things that the mistakes we made early on was we did a community needs assessment, and then we kind of lost our focus. We got too broad in our focus because um, probably most everybody that watches this is aware that on Long Island, there's a whole MS-13 thing going on with the MS-13 gangs, which is on the South Shore and probably 15, 20, 30 miles away from us. And, most of our team, we're Caucasian and we don't mix into that community very well. And we're trying to figure out how to do that. And then trying to figure out how to get into different organizations that are reaching out to the vulnerable. We ran into some snags trying to connect with some of those organizations, and we kind of started getting overwhelmed. And I know the thing that helped us the most is we had a coaching call with you. And what we realized is that I think a key word in all of this is, or phrase, are those that are the most vulnerable. And the encouragement you gave us at that point is, you guys are on the right track. Just stay with the most vulnerable, both in your church and in your community, and don't worry about it. And so that's when something really began to click, because we had things happen like down the street from our church. We had a couple of months ago, 3 months ago, we had an elderly couple that apparently used to go to the church years and years ago. He was facing a terminal illness, and it's a sad story, but he decided to take her life, and then he took his own life. And we realized here's a couple that lives in a suburban house right on our block, just a mile down, and they're vulnerable. So the question became, who else is vulnerable on our street? And you're looking at houses that, these are houses that are $400,000 or $500,000 houses, and here's a couple that was in real trouble. Now, I didn't mean they were going to be trafficked or something, but they were vulnerable. And that's when we realized that we were on the right track. That's what we needed to stick with. So that began to shape the next things we started working on.
It's interesting because when we think of something like human trafficking, our minds immediately go towards whatever frame of reference we may have, which may be informed by what we've seen on the news or what we've read in books or what we've seen on TV and movies. But when we boil it down to the fact that traffickers target vulnerable people, and then we say, okay, the Bible is always talking about how the church can come alongside of vulnerable people and care for them in a way that's holistic, addressing physical, yes, but spiritual and emotional realities as well. And when we focus on that, we find ourselves, yes, we may be loving those who are single parents, or those with mental illness, or those who are homeless, or those who are youth who are at risk. We could be caring for those who are struggling with substance abuse or cyclical poverty or physical abuse. We never know who is most vulnerable in even our congregations. And it's interesting. I mean, one of the stories that really prompted Let My People Go early on to take this perspective was when I was speaking with a friend of mine, and she'd been trafficked by a boyfriend for 5 years. And I asked her, I said, well, what did the church do for you? And she laughed. She said, Raleigh, for 5 years, I went to church every Sunday and no one noticed. She's like, I didn't notice, because oftentimes those who've been victimized don't self-identify. Right. And they may not know, or they may be afraid. They've had someone manipulating them for a time. And so, but at the end of the day, people don't self-identify. And here's this person who was doing all the right things, but the church didn't notice. And I started thinking, like, how many people have I walked by in my own congregations
Mhm.
who I've, yes, proclaimed the gospel to, but maybe I failed to demonstrate the gospel to them. And
Mhm.
so how can we change that? And so, yes, when a church like yours partners with Let My People Go, the goal is to say, who are those most vulnerable within a 3 to 5 mile radius of the church? How do we care for those people who are in our spheres of influence? And you may find other people that you have other relationships with, but who are those that the church could really reach out to in your community? And it's interesting because each church that we work with, even though some churches may be close to other churches, they find out that there might be different pockets of vulnerable people in each small, tight-knit community.
Right.
And for us, we can't do that apart from having a justice ministry team, because, I mean, here's the rub. If we're going to be really honest here, though, and for those listening, Pastor Doyle is a mental health professional, and he's been doing this for a time. Not every pastor is a mental health professional. Not every pastor has experience working with those who are outwardly vulnerable, and those who are experiencing crisis. And what we found is it's often better to have a team who has some touch points, or who has worked with vulnerability in some form or facet, to be able to take that burden off the pastoral staff and be able to address things as first responders. And yes, allow the pastoral staff to speak in, but kind of take some of that weight off, and really, in a very Acts 6 kind of way, like what we would take as kind of an idea of a diaconate, like having a team come alongside and care for people while the pastor prays and preaches and focuses on shepherding the congregation. They can rest knowing that there's a justice ministry team addressing these things, addressing these needs. And so, how often does your justice ministry team meet?
Our team meets about every couple of weeks.
And so, have you found a trick for staying consistent and doing that?
Well, it's embedded in what we do as our small group. So because of the way we built, I don't know if this would work for everybody, but for us, the way it worked was that our community is also, um, we build our relationships with one another, but one of the things we're building relationships around is also our missional emphasis, which is let my people go. So it's embedded together, and that's how, um, and we meet twice a month, but we don't talk about let my people go every time, but it's always, we probably talk about it at least every other time in terms of our strategies and our plans and what's next and assignments. We talk about it in between. We'll send out emails to remind everybody to look at a webinar or look at another resource that we're working on together, a survey or something. So that's how we accomplish it together, in that kind of schedule and process.
And that's incredible, because the justice ministry team is ultimately tasked with mobilizing the church, and we can't mobilize the church unless we're meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as you are kind of going down this journey, what are you learning about mobilizing your church through this team of individuals who've come together to address justice and mercy in your community?
Well, we're actually just on the beginning of, we took the church survey and then a community survey, and we've been revising those and adapting those to our context. And we've been working on that the last couple of meetings. And so our next step is, in particular, mobilizing the church. We want to use the community survey to encourage the whole church to help us do a couple of things. One is to go you know, our church is embedded in a neighborhood. There's probably 4,000 houses around us, and just in a, you know, probably 3-block radius around us, there's probably 400 houses. So our justice ministry team, we can't do it all ourselves. So we need to use the whole church, and we're going to be asking them to help us with the survey. And then with the survey, we're going to use that as an opportunity to do prayer walking. And we're going to hand these surveys off to people in the neighborhood and with an envelope, and ask them to, if they'd like, to return it, and maybe use that opportunity to say, is there anything we can pray for? And just see what happens. And wherever the Holy Spirit happens to meet us at the same time, we'll follow that as a person of peace and talk to them. And otherwise we'll bless them and go on to the next house. And so we're excited about that. That's going to happen sometime, you know, over this summer or late summer, early fall. That's our next step.
That's incredible. I think that's amazing, because this idea of finding people who they're in your community, but we may have never noticed them before.
Mm-hmm.
In a weird way, it's almost revolutionary, because yes, as churches, we're called to love our communities, but we want to be organic, but unless we're organized, some of that organic stuff's not going to happen. Even people who farm and who are organic farmers, they have to till the soil, you know, they have to do work. Like, there are things that they don't just expect things to grow. I mean, there are foragers, but all that said, with this analogy, my point is, I love how you guys are going out, you're doing surveys, you're actually getting to know your community, and you're doing it in a non-confrontational way and non-controversial way. You're saying, hey, who are those most vulnerable, and how can we serve?
Yeah.
And I think that's beautiful. And one thing that I've noticed with this kind of work is, when I was starting, you know, as a pastor in 2001, I was hearing all of these people, they were all writing these books, and they were preaching on it. How can we be relevant? How can we be relevant? And I think there's a beauty to relevance. It's when people realize that the gospel is the gospel of the common man, the common person, the regular Joe, the average Joe. And when we say, you know, there's no us and them, it's just us, and we're here, and God is moving, and we want to walk with our communities. I think when we do that, suddenly our churches become very relevant to our communities. And so I really appreciate you joining me on this webinar today. And I'm thankful that we've been able to have this conversation. And if anyone has any questions on Facebook Live, please just ask and we will answer those. But thank you all so much for joining us. And so with that said, Pastor Doyle, thank you.
Welcome.
And everyone else, we'll see you next time. It's always the first Tuesday of every week, and we meet at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And so until then, God bless you all.
Okay. Night.
Thank you. Take care.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.